Calling to order the Executive Committee of Silicon Valley Clean Energy on Friday, September 25th. We are operating under COVID rules as authorized by the governor, which means that we're doing the meeting on Zoom. Any member of the public is allowed to participate in this meeting. You can indicate your desire to do so by raising your virtual hand, or if you are on the phone, that can be done by pressing *9. I think we'll just move on. If I could get a roll call, please.
Thank you. Chair Miller?
Here.
Vice Chair Smith?
Here.
Gibbons?
Here.
Sinks?
Here.
Thank you. And currently is Director Abekoga.
We can slow down just a little bit if we want. Hopefully she'll find her way here. Is there any member of the public that wishes to comment on items not on the agenda? We do have somebody who wishes to speak. If there's anybody else, please raise your virtual hand. We could hear from James.
Hi. Good morning. This is James Tolea, resident of Sunnyvale, chair of Carbon Free Silicon Valley. Some comments I wanted to make at the beginning was wanted to thank the great work of some of the staff, or all the staff working on the eHub effort. Pamela, Don Bray, and others doing that. They've been very responsive to the public input, myself included among many others. And I think that's going to be a really great tool and resource for our communities, and showing leadership and example for others around the Bay and the state. So that's a great tool, as well as a shout out to John Sub for being there to answer questions as we're dealing here in Sunnyvale with REACH code discussions in our commissions and headed to council. So John's been really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Anyone else wish to speak? Seeing none, we will come back to the group. And our first item is the consent calendar, which just has the minutes on it.
I move approval of the consent calendar.
I have a question.
Okay, let's see if we can consummate the first and second, and then we'll do questions.
Okay, I'll second the motion.
Okay, we got a motion and a second. Now we'll go questions and comments. Go ahead, Liz.
I was just going to comment that there were a couple of items in the agenda minutes from 3 or 4 of us, and I wasn't sure staff had responded. I asked it for an update of the transition at the I think we requested an update to provide on the time of use transition, and I don't think we've had that. And then there was another one that said, is there a way of knowing how responsible SCVE or SVCE customers were in responding to the recent requests to reduce energy during the PSPS incident? And then there was another request. So there's a couple of requests in here. I think Director Sinks had one as well. I was just wondering if we're tracking those requests for information and if they've been followed up on.
We will make note of that and follow up after the meeting if we haven't. Thank you. So Andrea will make a note of that.
Thank you, Grish. Let me check, is there any member of the public that wishes to comment on the consent calendar? If you wish to do so, please indicate that by raising your virtual hand. Seeing none, are there any final comments from the board? Seeing none, we could get a roll call vote, please.
Thank you. Chair Miller?
Aye.
Vice Chair Smith?
Aye.
Gibbons?
Aye.
Sinks?
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries with Director Abekoga absent.
Okay. Next up, item number 2, CEO update. Grish.
Thank you, Chair Miller. members of the exec committee. Andrea is going to throw up a slide with a few points on there. So mostly information. First is we took to the finance committee a new benefit for our employees. It's called a health savings account. We plan to bring this to the board meeting on the consent calendar. It essentially is a cost-neutral program for SVCE, but it also benefits because some of our employees will find this extremely useful. So we are adding this to our benefit portfolio. The Finance Committee was very supportive of it, and I wanted to bring it to your attention that it will be brought to the board for approval at the next meeting. The second item is our strategic plan. Thank you very much for adopting the strategic focus areas at the September meeting. We are updating the actual strategic plan document. We are aiming to cut the length of the strategic plan by half. So it's going to be about half as long as before. And we are having meetings with all staff to get their input, whether it's tactics, goals, narrative, etc. So that is progressing quite well. The power prepay agreement, we presented this to the Finance Committee on September 15th, and we will be bringing a request to authorize me to enter into the necessary agreements to get ready to enter into this transaction. So we had a financial advisor from Public Financial Management present to answer questions from the Finance Committee, and they were quite supportive that we put this on the agenda. I am going to bring it up in open session, just because even though there isn't a financial impact today, it's something that is a long-term important issue. So we're going to bring it up in the discussion calendar. I'm now items D and E. I'm going to hand D over to Andrea and E to Kevin, and then open for questions on any of these items. Andrea?
Thank you, Girish. So the last time we talked about board education and specifically our education modules was back in May. So we thought it would be appropriate to update you on how we're doing with that. So we have hired a consultant to help us make our thoughts a little bit more concise in the order in which we will be presenting these modules. So it has a better flow to it and a better, clearer understanding of what it is of what we do. So we have developed 12, excuse me while I pull up a slide very quickly, 12 of these topics that we will be focusing on specifically through December. So our target date is to have these complete by December. And I will share with you here. These are the topics. And I know you guys are familiar with this because you helped us develop many of these. So we have an About Us section, board governance and operation, in addition to our power and programs. So again, our consultant will be helping us in developing these, and our target date is the end of the year. And we are hoping to have our very first one ready for you at the next executive committee meeting so you can take a look and tell us what you think.
Andrea, before you, oops. Oh, you don't have to put it back up. It's just maybe a quick question. Are we going to like hold them all and then they'll all go live at the same time? Or as we complete them, will we put them up?
I defer to Girish, but I would think that we would put them up as we get them developed.
Yes.
Saratoga is replacing the alternate because that guy resigned from our board. And so I will have a new person at my next council meeting, and whoever it is, they're not going to know a lot. So I have a guinea pig all ready for us to look at some of these.
That's great. And hopefully it'll be ready next month.
I hope we can add a module on raking the grid, because raking the forest is popular now, and we're talking about raking the air, and we could add raking the grid rather than merely cleaning it.
Well, we got to be happy, Rod. There's no more gas cars for sale in 15 years.
that's a big deal, a huge big deal. And people said at the Air District when we said we wanted to ban diesel in the Bay Area or eliminate diesel in the Bay Area by 2033, we were crazy. But now the state has come to the table, so it's cool.
Thank you. That concludes my update. So Kevin, if you're ready, I can pull up your slides.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Morning, board members. We'd just like to show a quick visual update on the new office space upstairs.
Can we pause 1 second, Kevin?
Yep.
There is something with your audio where it's dropping in and dropping out, or am I the only one that's hearing it that way? No.
Same problem.
That's what's happening.
I don't know if that means try and speak louder or be closer, but I think your computer's helping you trying to background reduce your voice or something. I think we just,
Am I audible now?
oh, that sounds better.
Okay, thank you so much for the update on the sound quality. So glad you can hear me now. This is a very brief photo essay of some of the first shots from the interior of our upstairs office space. Andrea, could you switch to the first slide? These are the lobby and break room spaces in the new upstairs office suite. You can see the more open layout, a lot of natural light from the windows, the very très chic, as one staff member said, hexagonal ceiling tiles. So we're looking at a bit more sort of modern office space than we've seen previously and we've enjoyed previously. Andrea, could you skip to the next slide? This is sort of a panoramic view of what it looks like at the moment. It looks very expansive. Of course, once we fill in with office furniture and staff and plants and copiers and everything, it will seem much smaller. But right now it's a nice wide open layout. And we look forward to moving in the next couple weeks. Next slide. This is the view from the break area. So it flows very openly into the remainder of the space. You know, like our current office space, like most offices these days, we're going to have to think about, you know, noise and sort of being respectful of our neighbors. But it should certainly, you know, once we're able to work back in the office, enhance our ability to collaborate and work across teams. Next slide, please. And then this is the smaller office section off to the side, which is the former Suite 340, where a majority of the private office spaces are. You can see that all of them have, you know, essentially floor to ceiling side lights to allow natural light in and provide some porosity to the office. And then there will be a small set of cubes here as well. So just a quick update on timing. We've done the punch list walkthrough. Thankfully, there's only a few small items to go over. But staff has begun the process of boxing up all of the office material from 290. And within the next couple weeks, we will be boxed up and moved upstairs and able to hand over our existing suite back to the landlord in about a couple weeks' time. So we look forward to the point at which we can invite you all to see the space in person. Once we get set up upstairs, I would like to work with our admin staff to do a bit of a virtual walkthrough that we would love to share with you all when that's ready. So that's my update on space for now. I'd be happy to take any questions.
In terms of logos and stuff like that, are we going to paint the big logo on that big white wall at the entry, or
Yep.
are we doing artwork on the front door? What's the vision for that kind of stuff?
So we haven't gotten into decoration. We'll I think settle in with the first wave of or first phase of office furniture and then take a look at what makes sense layout wise. But I can definitely speak to the door. The door is going to be replaced. It currently has safety glass with sort of that wire mesh in it, which looks a
Right.
little
Retro.
Yeah, so that's getting replaced with clear safety glass and a new door, and will, you know, mirror the design of the downstairs entry with the logo printed on the side light.
Okay, excellent. And I like how you guys did the big table thing in the break room. It's just exactly the size for your demonstration cooktop that they won't let us put in. It looks beautiful. Rod, you had some questions?
Yeah, I was I know that in my city, the city has a couple of businesses that rent space from the city. At least where I am, folks that have leases are getting some relief from rents during this time of pandemic. And I don't know if that's a thing in Sunnyvale. If you've brokered any discussion with the broker or the owner about perhaps some rent relief.
We have not directly explored that yet, but we could certainly approach them if the board desires.
Yeah, I would give it a try, or, you know, check in with the broker who helped you, or brokers who have helped you in the past, and see if that's going on.
Sure.
But yeah, I know my council took action on a couple of our leaseholders and reached an agreement while we're, you know, they're unable to use current space. This could go on for another year or more, right? And so it's worth an ask.
I mean, Rod, we're getting a vaccine in 5 weeks and we're all going to be cured by the election. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Howard. Okay, that was it. Congratulations. It looks like a beautiful space. I think, you know, I've been attending some of the meetings that the Air District has sponsored on remote work. And we are also now reading about Google's plans. And it seems like we've had surveys at the Air District and at MTCA BAG, and it seems like the model that employees are hoping for is a hybrid model where they'd be able to work off site some days and be able to come in some days, because there are positive aspects of both. And so I sure look forward to visiting the office as an unelected to say hi and advocate for whatever it is going on at the time. But congratulations on getting this space ready to go. We'll look forward to being back there, let me tell you.
We are as well. Thank you so much.
Were there other questions on this item, on this part of this item?
So
Was that the
okay.
conclusion
Yeah.
of your report?
Yes, it is. And more of a heads up on the board meeting next month is going to have a rather large agenda. You can just see from what's coming up in the exec committee today and what I teed up for you, things coming up from the finance committee also. So just a heads up so you're aware of the things that are being worked on. That's the end of my report, Chair Miller.
Okay, does anybody have questions of Girish? Let me check with the public. Is there any member of the public that wishes to comment on the CEO report? Seeing none, we'll come back to us. This was just informational. Thank you, Girish. So we'll move on. Next up is 3, our Building Decarbonization Joint Action Plan.
Great. Excuse me. Sorry, I have a little bit of a frog in my throat. Having a hard time getting started here. Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to present. This item is on the Building Decarb Joint Action Plan. I did want to acknowledge a couple other presenters that we have, a couple other panelists. I'll lead the presentation, but they may be chiming in on the questions, and that's John Supp, of course, and as well as Janica McFeely from Integral Group. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this presentation is to share the final draft of the Building Decarb Joint Action Plan, to get your feedback on a draft proposal to the board, excuse me, to adopt the plan, as well as an implementation budget and timeline. I will note that there are several slides in this presentation. I do try to heed Director Miller's advice to not fear the appendix, but this is kind of a big deal. It's involved many months of stakeholder engagement and staff effort, and it's designed to set SVCE's and our member agency priorities for the coming 3 years for the sector that results in currently 1/3 of our emissions. So I will go through the slides quickly. If you want me to slow down, or if you want to interrupt with any questions, please, of course, feel free to do that. Next slide, please. By way of background, the board adopted a decarb strategy. Excuse me, next slide, please. So I'll go through some background first. I'll go into the Decarb plan and then talk about next steps. By way of background, the board, as you know, adopted a Decarb strategy in December of 2018 that set our overarching and integrated approach for reducing emissions across multiple sectors. The sectors shown in the Venn diagram on the left that we often like to include. Next slide, please. For power supply, we have a deeper sector-specific plan that's updated on a biennial basis, our integrated resource plans. Also for mobility, for transportation emissions, we adopted a sector-specific plan for that area. The Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Joint Action Plan was adopted by the board last year, September 2019. This plan is the sector-specific plan that focuses on the built environment. Next slide, please. The development of this plan was brought forward to the board for approval as a program priority back in February of this year. The board also approved a contract with Integral Group for support. And from April through June, staff and Integral Group carried out background research and stakeholder engagement to inform the development of a draft. A draft was distributed and we carried out stakeholder engagement on the draft in July and August. In August and September is when we updated that draft to the version that you see attached to your packet. Next slide, please. So here's a visual representation of that timeline, as well as some figures on the number of folks that were involved in the process along the way, and also specifically when we made pit stops to the MOG and the exec committee. So all of that's to say what we're bringing you today has a lot of fingerprints on it, and it's gone through a lot of vetting. Next slide, please. So moving on to the next section of the presentation, it's the plan itself. As I mentioned, the written plan is attached to the packet. I have some slides summarizing it here. Next slide, please. SVCE has made a lot of progress, as you all know, reducing community-wide emissions by offering carbon-free electricity supply. The two largest remaining sources of emissions for our communities are transportation and natural gas. And natural gas emissions are predominantly from appliances and buildings. So to address climate change, we have to use our clean electricity to decarbonize these other sectors. Next slide, please. To inform the development of this plan, we carried out a buildings baseline study, which was a bottoms-up, very data-intensive study to fully characterize energy and emissions from buildings in our community. So this is a so-called Sankey diagram from that study that separates or characterizes emissions by fuel source, sector, and end use. All of the numbers that you see on this chart are in metric tons of CO2. So this is a chart on emissions. I realize this is kind of busy. I want to just point out three things. On the very left, this shows emissions from buildings by fuel source. As you can see, most emissions are coming from natural gas. Then if you look at the second set of vertical lines, based on the building stock in our communities, roughly half of emissions are coming from the residential sector and another half coming from the commercial sector. And then if you look on the right-hand side of the chart, this shows the disaggregation of emissions by end use. And so you'll see that most of the emissions are due to space and water heating. Next slide. To address emissions, we have to address natural gas in buildings, and that really means electrification. Next slide. And as you all know, we aren't talking about the coil stoves and resistance furnaces of the past, but the modern efficient electric appliances such as heat pumps and induction stoves. Next slide. Although 1 in 4 homes in the US is all electric, and all electric buildings are industry standard in many other parts of the country and the world. In California, we have primarily dual fuel buildings. That is, buildings that have both natural gas and electricity service. So there are significant barriers from getting where we are now to all electric. And the 5 barriers that are shown here were influenced by the Building Decarbonization Coalition's Building Decarbonization Roadmap, where they identified these 5 barriers, and we validated these through our own stakeholder engagement process. So addressing these barriers to achieve market transformation really requires a full suite of interventions. Next slide. Some of those interventions, SVCE and member agencies are really well positioned to drive, and others, of course, are better suited for other agencies and stakeholders. So some of the types of actions that are needed are shown here: retail products and services, more education and outreach, new policy, market transformation. And so, for instance, under retail products and services, that includes rate design, includes financing incentives, building to grid integration. Under education, public awareness campaigns. Under policies, of course, REACH codes, other building ordinances that address existing buildings. And under market transformation, for instance, innovation, workforce development, regional coordination. Next slide, please. So to help filter and evaluate all of the potential strategies and actions that could have been included in this plan, what we did from the very beginning is applied the strategic framework from the Decarb roadmap. So it includes all of these categories of action included in the teal stripe at the top. As a part of that framework, the orange bar, which priorities will guide us. These 5 priorities were how we evaluated, which actions would make the most sense for us to pursue, as well as the green bar at the bottom, how we do things. Everything that we do in programs and beyond across the organization, we try to prioritize innovation using data and partnerships. And so we applied this framework when we developed this plan. Next slide, please. The primary activities that are in the plan are areas that are within SVCE and member agency kind of spheres of control. There is a section on some supporting actions, and these actions are really things that we may not have direct control over, but we certainly can influence, or at least can try to influence. And so what's shown below there are some of the things that are some of the areas within our spheres of influence. Next slide, please. All right, so the following set of slides are a summary of the key part of the action plan, specifically the proposed cornerstone actions, which are the priority actions that we're proposing. And the plan is divided into these 3 sections: new construction, specifically accelerating the transition to all electric new construction and not extending the natural gas infrastructure further, or fossil fuel infrastructure further, given their stranded assets. The second part of the second focus area is existing buildings, specifically addressing all of the dual fuel homes and buildings that we already have, converting them to all electric. And then the third focus area is market development, really to cultivate this regional ecosystem that we know that we need in order to advance our common building decarbonization goals. Next slide. And so under these 3 focus areas, there are 6 cornerstone actions. And so they're listed here. There's 1 under new construction, 4 under existing buildings, and then 1 under market development. So I'll go through each of them in the next slides. Next slide, please, Andrea. Thank you. Under new construction, there's 1, specifically what we called REACH Code Initiative 2.0. So this cornerstone action is a continuation of the REACH Code effort to address, in this case, gaps in application, potentially specific technologies such as storage, as well as looking forward to the 2022 code cycle. Next slide, please. Under existing buildings, this is where we see the majority of the cornerstone actions and where we're ramping up our activity. The first one is buildings on a statewide basis are being assessed emissions and pathways to achieving deep decarbonization through AB 3232. So what this is EB1, feasibility assessment for a natural gas phase out by 2045. It takes what's happening at the state level and really looks at it through a local lens, given our local conditions, our building stock, our communities, what are the specific technical, legal, and economic barriers for achieving this statewide goal. The second one, local policy options to decarbonize existing buildings. This is kind of akin to the REACH code effort to support member agencies in the development and adoption of local policies. This could include a differential utility users tax, retrofit on burnout. There are a variety of different policy options that are under consideration and have been surfaced and looked into through the stakeholder engagement. Next slide, please. The other two under existing buildings are shown here, and these two are more SVCE led, specifically expanding our FutureFit heat pump water heater program to be FutureFit homes and buildings. And so that is expanding to other end uses beyond just water heaters, and specifically positioning ourselves as a central point of contact to help our customers navigate the many incentive programs that are already out there, and to really use SVCE's limited resources to target gaps and address participation barriers. And so to approach it in a very targeted fashion. The fourth one is accessible financing, specifically to help support an equitable transition to deep decarbonization. Next slide, please. Then under market development, the cornerstone action here is regional coordination. And it's very much akin to in the EVI plan, the regional coordination priority there. So we already have a model basically that we can build from. This was certainly a priority that had surfaced during the stakeholder engagement. And so we'd be initiating a regional forum for coordination across many different stakeholder groups to advance our common goals. Next slide, please. In addition to those cornerstone actions, there are a variety of existing actions that the board has already approved that are in various stages of deployment and development. And there are also other supportive actions where we aren't going to be the lead, but it's something that's within our sphere of influence, for instance, state policy. And so in the plan and on this slide, we wanted to be sure to reflect those existing activities and supportive actions because they're an important part of the full package of what we're proposing. Next slide, please. To implement this plan will require significant resources, both staff resources and budget. When this goes to the board, we will bring an implementation request. The range, excuse me, it's intended to be structured similarly to the EVI plan request. If you recall, I know that was a year ago, the EVI plan request was an $8 million overarching request to implement the plan over a 4-year period, $2 million per year. And so we would structure the request similarly for this building decarb plan, likely a $6 million request over a 3-year period. And to clarify, this is all coming from the program's budget. So the 2% of operating revenues that are set aside for programs, what the request would be is to just allocate a certain amount of that money to specifically implementation of this plan. Next slide, please. One more. Thank you. All right, so I realize that was a lot of information. Thank you very much for your attention. I am happy to answer any questions and also would like to acknowledge some folks who I see as attendees here. Just to kind of reiterate, there were a lot of stakeholders involved in this, and kind of 2 groups that I'll point out are MOG members. We made multiple pit stops to get their input, and they provided input even prior to this becoming a priority that we brought forward to the board during the formulation of this, the development of this plan as a potential program area. So definitely want to acknowledge all of their input, as well as our community members. And I see Bruce and James are on the line here. They're very involved and were very generous with their feedback. So certainly very appreciate their engagement, very much appreciate their engagement.
Okay, so I'll ask probably the 2 obvious questions. And one is, Rod and I already mentioned it, right? So our map really kind of gets a little vague at 2030. I'm wondering, now that we know what the state's doing at 2035 on the transportation front, it seems like there's going to be some forecasts for emissions in the state as we roll over from gas to all electric vehicles. So I'm wondering if there's a way, it's too soon, but if there's a way at some point to extend that little chart which showed the really fine bars. It's early in the presentation, well, middle presentation. Hope you're on mute.
Actually, Andrea, could you pull up the slide? I want to make sure that we are referring to the right one. This is SVCE service territory emissions, the historical emissions as well as the forecasted ones. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. And the details, Andrea finds that one, the details on that slide, they become just lines at 2030. And I really feel like the state made a huge and bold move at 2035 and future forecasts, I'm sure.
Yeah, I did want to mention in this plan at the very end, the final section, there are a few things mentioned. That final section covers how we would track progress. And so there are some specific KPIs listed.
Yeah, slide 10, slide 10. That was the one. I've always loved this slide. What good is it shows that this is a hard problem. And it's interesting with transportation being the top and the state's kind of wrapped its arms around that a little farther out. It further reinforces for me and for us that it's that orange line, that natural gas line, which is kind of where the focus is. I mean, we've done stuff to facilitate the transition to electric cars. And I think that's all been valuable stuff. But I think the jig's up. The state's saying we're not going to sell gas cars after 2035. So the top is going to take care of itself. Sounds really bad to say that, but they got it. So it's really the next one. It's that orange one. And so that brings us to the plan that we have. And I very much appreciate the plan. And you know me, I'm the model of consumer, canary in the coal mine, shall we say. I actually have tried actively now for 4 weeks to replace my natural gas powered heater with a heat pump. And the best I can get is a contractor who says, since you can't run a heat pump in our extremely cold climate here in Saratoga, he's recommending a hybrid. So it would be gas and heat pump. So we should never lose track that, and I even got the Home Depot guys, right? It's terrible out there in the real world. It's almost impossible to get an all electric appliance in a natural gas market. And so I know there's a lot of things that we're doing to help consumer, but I wish that we had a fork that said we were going after Lowe's and Home Depot and all the major retailers and kicked them upside the head and said, look, you need to quit telling customers that things like a heat pump hot water heater will cost 5 times as much. Or in my case, they're telling me literally, if I get a heat pump heater, my family will be cold in December, January, and February. That's what I'm being told. So I don't know how we solve that, but there needs to be a focus on some of these major players to get their attitude adjusted. So maybe that wasn't a question, maybe that was a comment. Rod, do you have real questions though?
Well, I have a comment, but I could wait for public input or whatever, so.
You can make it now, then our public knows what we're thinking, and we'll come back to comments at the end. This is a big deal, so you get 2 bites at the apple.
Oh, wow, okay. I'll try to be brief. Yeah, I commend you for this plan. I'm looking forward to its adoption. As far as I'm concerned, for the rest of the life of the agency, we could handle all the business of the agency in the next 3 months before some of us are turned out. We'll all feel great about our contribution. But I think you're right, Howard. Focusing on building decarbonization is a really worthy place for us to be, because it seems like it's really in our wheelhouse to think about how we have resiliency on the grid, and how we really move the world forward. You know, ARENA numbers are coming out. I don't know if you noticed, the Housing Methodology Committee completed its work, but in my city, our ARENA is going to be 6 times what it was in the current what it is in the current cycle. Okay, it's 2.5 Valcos that the next council in my city is going to have to do. Think about all of the opportunity in decarbonizing 2.5 Valcos. I mean, it's huge. And, you know, advocates have talked to me about taking our reach codes farther, actually saying, let's see if we could, through a combination of incentives and mandates, figure out how the next water heater in my home is not gas. So when it fails, or before it fails, or my next furnace is going to be electric by some means, right? If we think about all of that building stock that's both new, we're going to get a lot more. There's going to be a lot more building over the next decade or so. And I think we also have an opportunity in the retrofits. So I think there are terrific aspects of my plan. My favorite chart is still the Zenke chart. I think it helps people really see from soup to nuts, you know, what's going on with our greenhouse gas emissions. So I like that. As Mr. Supp was, I was at Los Altos council meeting this week. Got my 2 or 3 minutes in, 1.5 minutes in, talking about why we needed to take aggressive action. And they did it in commercial buildings, but single family homes under their proposal will still have gas fireplaces, gas barbecues, gas pool heaters, and gas kitchens. So I think we are going to have to continue to work to move the world forward with our programs, and it'll be a combination of mandates and programs. But I commend you, Amy. You spent some time with me recently to go through some of these plans in detail, and I'm just so impressed and so proud of the work that this agency is doing. That's it.
Then we'll do Liz, then Nancy, and then Margaret. Go ahead, Liz.
I'm going to see if I can get all this to work. So obviously, I think what we have in front of us is extraordinary in what it's trying to achieve and how it reflects our organization. Excuse me. I would like to go back to a couple of points that I have been talking about for a while. And so I'm going to make some comments, questions, if you will, and then have two asks. So one question has to do with the terminology of using the term building decarbonization. I'm a little concerned that that is a little too insular to where we are in our world, not to the broader world that's going on outside of us and outside of California, more national and international, where there's the conversation about decarbonizing buildings, which talks about the life cycle of a building, which goes all the way from when the material is being generated to when it's being constructed, to when it's being operated, to when it's being decomposed or deassembled, and then when it is literally going, quote unquote, to the junkyard. So there's a much bigger picture out there than what we are using for the term building decarbonization. So I think that as we go forward, it would help if we had some definitions in the document about what we're talking about for decarbonization. To me, it's really, we're talking about the source of the power and the operational use of power. It's not, I'm going to say, it's not really decarbonizing buildings. I stress on that, the use of that word. And I will say, I did not have the ability to talk with Amy in advance. So these are coming off left field for staff. So I apologize for that. The other comment, let's see, is we're using a term joint. I'm going to go back to my diagram here. I think I can find it. Sorry, I'm switching screens. That won't work. There it is. And also using, that's not it either. Sorry, switching screens doesn't work easily, sorry. We also, we have a lot of training and things that we're talking about. And what I have been saying all along, and I'm sorry I wasn't clear enough, when I was talking about engaging professional organizations, having them participate in this process is important. But when we're talking about training, and that was done, but when we're talking about how this program is going to be implemented, there a couple of things that I didn't see, which is how do you engage with the people that are actually going to be designing these buildings? They're going to be designing the new buildings, and they're going to be designing the retrofits. And that to me continues to be professional organizations. And I don't see in the program list of outreach and innovation and some other things you've got there, where we're actually going out and educating the people that are most likely to actually design the implementation of what we want. So to me, that's missing. There are other subtleties like doing training programs for building officials on all of this stuff, particularly when it's retrofitted, as Director Miller just said. Stuff like that, I think would be helpful. Having a common inspection or plan review for a lot of these implementations, I think would be another good program. So I'm missing that, what I call that outreach beyond our own group, our own comfort group, if that's the right phrase, to engage them in this new thinking. So it's just I feel like my comments have been pretty consistent on the language and what we are really trying to say. So I have more comments, but my two asks are that we really, when we're using the term building decarbonization, we really understand what that means. And it doesn't mean the same to everybody else as it does to us. The big move nationally and internationally is to decarbonize the built environment, which goes all the way through materials. And the operational costs of carbon are minuscule compared to, it's about a 25% as opposed to a 75% carbon impact. So I think we need a definition in the first about this plan. I think we need to do that because, and I'm also honestly not sure what joint action plan really means. Are we trying to say it's a joint action plan between the Silicon Valley Clean Energy member organizations? So I was a little reading through it this time. I just wondered why we're using that phrasing. But my two asks are that we somehow rather put in a clear definition of what we mean by building decarbonization, which to me means power source and operational costs, types of things, and also how we reach out and add programs to the professionals that are actually going to be designing and implementing this.
Thank you, Liz. I said that we do Nancy and then Margaret.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is fabulous. It's a very tight, well thought out program. There's a lot of things that I don't know how we'll implement yet. For instance, there's some financing. There's a lot of mention of financing for low-income communities and doing various, making use of financing tools. So one question that I had for staff is are you envisioning that SVCE would provide the financing tools, or would we work with partners for that? So that's one question I had. And let's see. And I see that there's some references in the index, which is great. But the MAST paper isn't linked to, so if we could get a copy of the MAST paper, I would really appreciate that on the tariffed on-bill programs. Let's see what else. And I like how you kind of, what's the right word? I think it's, I like how you called things misaligned policies for the policy work. I think that's about right. And it's a really great time to present some of us with talking points for upcoming conferences with, say, youth climate action groups and the like. So I'm really excited by this, and I like to see all of the pictures we've been seeing over the last year being developed put into this one document. So I'm looking forward to taking this forward. I just have maybe a couple of suggestions about the slides that I'll send out privately. Won't take people's time with that, but really good work. Very comprehensive and exciting.
All right, thank you, Nancy. Margaret?
Thank you, and thank you to staff for the presentation. I really found it helpful. It's pretty concise, and I was going to ask if, well, I guess we have if we could get the slide deck, that would be really helpful. I'm kind of, and I also wanted to, before I start, just say hello to Janica McFeely with Integral. She's actually an old-time family friend of my husband's side, so he might pop in to say hi too, but it's really exciting to be working with a close friend. I had a few questions. The first one is, I signed a letter as mayor in support of, to the CUP in support of all electric building code. Wondering where that is. I hadn't heard any update on their decision or when they're making that decision. Would staff know about that?
Yeah, great question. I'm not exactly positive on the timeline where they're planning to release. I think this is about the 2022 building code cycle. Is that right? Whether it will be an all electric baseline. I think there's been a groundswell, certainly of support for movement towards that all electric, and kind of recognition of the leadership of the cities on obviously you all. I believe it's early next year, but I would need to get back with you. I guess John or Janica, if you know better, please feel free to chime in when that code will be released.
Yeah, they'll start working on the actual code this fall, but a lot of the position papers that kind of form the basis of how the code will be updated have been completed already. And while it's not right now, at least, all electric for everything, it has changed a lot of the games to favor electrification within the code and how things are calculated. So it's really positive, especially for multifamily, where there was a lot of barriers previously. There's still a lot more room to grow, but we'll see more probably this fall as it starts to get worked on.
Okay, great. The reason why I ask is that, you know, as we've passed all electric requirements, I'm starting to feel the aftershock effects right now. And so, you know, I've mentioned this before, but the slides would be helpful and the talking points, but I really would appreciate help for us to be able to explain why we did this. I've also learned, I think there's some area, well, the plus side is we approved 2 projects, one, the Google Landings project, which will be all electric, and we did approve a multifamily Summerhill project that's all electric. So my hope is that that will show that this is a good thing and a positive thing. But I even got asked yesterday by our local paper if I regret the decision to go require all electric. And so I think there's just need for more public education engagement. We do have this cool blocks program that we just started, and I'm hoping, you know, they can be helpful in getting the word out. But some of it is also just some issues that I need to understand better. But I got an email from a woman who wanted to switch to electric water heater and was told it would take 3 weeks to get the permit. So I'm not sure. I have to look to see if that's an internal thing. But is there a way that we can streamline some of these processes? And as I think it was Nancy or Liz was saying, you know, have one uniform way to get these through the system much more quickly and make it an incentive if, you know, you're going electric versus an old water heater, regular water heater type of thing. And then the other area, yeah, I think it's just education, because I didn't even realize this too, but our requirement now says that if you're going to remodel your house and I think increase it by, or change 51% of your home, you have to go electric. And that's been a bit of a shock to some folks. So I think we just need to clarify our policies better, but just in general, what this means, I think would be helpful to be able to share and educate the community on. And then the one other question that came up, financing, and my question is financing of what is it actually, you know, actually helping individuals with acquiring electric, you know, appliances and whatnot. Is it for the like development community? Yeah, if you could explain that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. So regarding the slides and talking points, I would say through the stakeholder engagement, there's definitely expressed a need for more coordinated messaging, including from our member agency staff. And there are 2, what's listed under supportive actions that are existing in supportive actions that I wanted to point out. One is specifically, we are participating in a regional positive messaging campaign organized through the Building Decarbonization Coalition. And I believe that kicks off this fall. And it's called The Switch Is On. And so that's kind of one step, I think, towards more broad-based public messaging related to support for all electric. We also, through the regional, the regional coordination effort is where we would also be doing a lot of coordination as it relates to messaging and messaging needs, identifying those needs and filling those gaps. And so I think any continuation, for instance, of a regional messaging campaign could come through that. So there were a couple of things that I wanted to mention on that. And then to your the question that you had asked about financing. And so this is really geared towards primarily homeowners and building owners who are going to be hopefully making changes to electrify their dual fuel homes. and giving them financing options that would enable them to make that transition, both access to capital and then also address upfront cost barriers. And so those are the primary target audiences. But I think in some subsectors, if some of the financing of a building is done through a developer, then there could be the identification of a need to develop an option or a program for those folks as well.
Margaret, it might not have been your city that said it was 3 weeks to get a permit. I tried the hot water thing 2 years ago. Now I'm on the heater thing, and the contractors are awful. They do everything possible to try and talk you out of an all-electric appliance. And I'm not talking like one guy I've found on the street, lots. Okay, so with that, we got to go to the public. So I know we got some public that are going to want to speak on this. I think at a minimum, Bruce is with us. And
Okay, Bruce, you're up.
Thank you very much. There are 3 points I'd like to make, but before I make any, I want to speak to the water heater permitting, Margaret and others. My understanding is that because most water heaters are replaced on an emergency basis, cities don't require a permit in advance of the replacement. They require a permit to be obtained in a reasonable amount of time after the replacement. And so if that isn't the case in Mountain View today, that might be an easy switch that makes it convenient for the contractor and the homeowner. But one of the things I wanted to talk about in particular is the use of certified carbon offsets. So in Mountain View, we have a goal to be carbon neutral by 2045, but the expectation is that the actual carbon emissions will only be down 80% compared to our baseline. So where is that other 20% going to come from? My understanding is that the only place it can come from is carbon offsets. And Amy, I apologize. I've read previous iterations of your strategy, but I have not read the one that you sent out in advance of this meeting. So if there's information about offsets in there, I haven't read it. But as an example, Google recently announced that not only is it offsetting, buying carbon-free electricity today, it has purchased offsets to eliminate all of the company's emissions since it was founded in the late 90s. And when I mentioned this in a conference call recently that was attended by a LinkedIn representative, she said, oh, well, LinkedIn and Microsoft have also made a commitment to do that. It'll be a few years farther out because we're older companies, but they also intend to use offsets as a way to completely eliminate the carbon footprint of those companies since their founding. Buying offsets is something that anyone can do today, and I think it would make sense for SVCE to guide that action, to, just as we're providing contractor recommendations, provide offset recommendations, and perhaps make that something that's available on the eHub. Switching topics a little bit, when I was in a public policy class at Berkeley when I was 25, a quote was attributed to then Governor Jerry Brown, which was, political leadership consists of finding out where the parade is already going and getting in front of it. I found that to be really cynical at the time, but I think it's actually in some ways very accurate. And I think that's what Governor Newsom has done with his electric car mandate. I think the parade is already going there. And so by making his executive order, he's getting out in front of an existing parade and taking credit or prospective credit for the accomplishment of a goal that would have been accomplished anyway. The building decarbonization steps, there's no parade. We're seeing the backlash in cities like Los Altos. It's going to be a much tougher lift. And so I would encourage SVCE to think about how they can support local electeds in getting out in front of that parade, which is not actually going anywhere right now.
okay, thank you. Thank you, Bruce, I think.
Okay, looks like we have 2 additional
Yep.
attendees. We will go next with James.
Hi, this is James Talea, resident of Sunnyvale. I'm chair of Carbon Free Silicon Valley, also local advocate here in Sunnyvale, as well as on the advisory committee of the Campaign for Fossil Free Buildings in Silicon Valley, which has been very active with the REACH code effort across Santa Clara and San Mateo counties. And the Carbon Free Silicon Valley is also across those same two counties. And I wanted to say a big thank you to staff and consultants for all the great work here, and particularly in such extensive research and being proactive about it and being very responsive and receptive to that input of the stakeholders. And it's very much reflected. I see a lot of changes, improvements really comes through. It's, as others have been saying, it's really important, this building decarb, building usage decarbonization joint action plan, because of not only the carbon, but the air we breathe, the health and safety in our homes and the community. So a couple of things. Now, this naturally is a broad framework, as it's the upper level plan. There, I understand, will be more detailed implementation plan with budgets and more details coming associated with this and to follow this. So it's hard to get the all the details here, but the overall, I think this comes through really well as a understanding, as the the staff and this plan really comes through as a framework for market transformation. And market transformation was an area that I was in the last couple years at PG&E when I worked there, and it's really the wrapper around all of this, not just one area of market development as it seems defined in this plan, but really the foundation that makes everything easier and supports the elected, supports the public in trying to move forward. This is a hard problem, and along with the KPIs and the metrics that are going to need to be in there that the staff acknowledges in that paragraph near the end. One other aspect of a market transformation effort is to have MTIs, market transformation indicators, that help track how the foundation layers are going. And so I think it's going to be important to see this overall thing, this effort, as a market transformation effort with metrics associated with it. And I think that's all I have time for, but really appreciate it. I think it was great, and the regional effort and coordination is really important.
Thanks, James.
And our last speaker is Tony Ulo.
Good morning, friends. I of course, wanted to thank Amy and other staff for their ongoing leadership on this issue, and I think that the plan as developed is in a really good place. I've been fairly moved actually this morning listening to the comments of people who spoke before me, and it hadn't become clear to me before how important it is that we really win the war of hearts and minds on this issue, or face a backlash. And so when Amy talked about participating in the Building Decarb Coalition's outreach efforts and everything, I think that's a good start, but I actually think we need to engage in a public education and transformation campaign here locally, both to protect the electeds that have been brave in adopting REACH codes, as well as in making all the consumers in our area recognize that all the cool kids are going electric, and all the moms that care about their children are insisting on electric cooking, as well as changing the hearts and minds of the contractors. I know that we've already started some of that work associated with some of the COVID relief, but probably an expansive an expansion of that effort is really warranted, as Howard mentioned. Thanks much.
Thanks for being with us, Tony. Any other member of the public wish to speak on this? Then I will come back to us as the board. We got so many other items. If anybody wants to make a final comment, I would just ask that it would be brief. And I see Liz and Nancy's hands up.
Okay, so sorry, my comments aren't going to be brief, Howard. I appreciate the need. This is important. Just to be clear, I think I said it, but not obviously not strongly enough. I think what we have in front of us and the effort by staff is great. I'm very appreciative of that. And it's easy for me to focus on things that I think are missing. And I had kind of hoped to get an answer from Amy because I did look at the, the Decarbonization Coalition document, and they have a very good introduction where they do in fact talk about where buildings fit in the overall scheme of greenhouse gas emissions. And I think a context of that is really important. And we don't have that. And that's what I was talking about by definitions. And I was wondering why we weren't talking about educating the people that I think of are going to be implementing it, being the architects, the engineers, the specification people, the contractors, and the building officials. Just as an FYI, even during COVID, I grant you in San Jose, not in us, San Jose took 5 months to approve a solar system on a house. So we need to have, I'm wondering why we don't have something like that in the program, in the recommendation.
Yeah, thank you for your comments, Director Gibbons. Regarding the definition, I can definitely, clarify that point. I can definitely add a definition as well as revisit the introduction to ensure it's kind of clear how we are defining this term building decarb in the plan and make it clear what the broader context is. Regarding the second point about educating designers and developers. And so a lot of that is incorporated into the REACH code effort. And so I can understand how it isn't as visible in what's shown. And so for the REACH code 1.0 effort, for instance, if you recall, we came back with a request to increase the implementation budget of that REACH code effort to include technical assistance and education to designers and contractors. And so it's kind of been packaged, if you will, as a part of that effort. I would say the other place where it would really kind of come to the forefront is under the regional coordination. And so that's really where we would want to engage specifically architects, designers, and developers on a quarterly or potentially semi-annual basis. We're not sure exactly what the cadence is, but that's where we want to bring different folks from across the sector and put them in the same room and have them share their perspectives with each other. So I would say that's another place that we see a lot of activity with the stakeholders that you mentioned.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just worried about to be successful, we have to find a way to implement this and as I think Tony just said, win the minds and hearts of the people that are going to be doing this work. And as an architect or an engineer, if you're working with a client, you're the one that sells some things to clients. They take your recommendations on windows and roofing materials and other things. And they're really an upfront, be it a contractor that does design build or whatever for residential or whatever. It's where the marketplace is. And I guess I wish there was a little more emphasis in the language about that, and also the building officials and having a common standard of reviewing solar systems and the hot water and the gas and so forth. So that's just, it's the implementation aspect of it and getting the buy-in that it's just not clear enough to me.
Yeah, and it would be helpful Oops, sorry.
That's right.
I was just going to say, I can plan to follow up with you afterwards, or at least it would be certainly helpful for me to ensure that I am taking into your feedback into account appropriately. I also did want to mention the streamlining community-wide electrification program that we have underway, which is looking at all of our member jurisdictions and carrying out benchmark assessment of permitting processes as well as interconnection processes. So that's actually kicked off a month ago. And so by the end of the year or early next year, we'll have a benchmarking assessment of those processes and some recommendations. And so we're developing a best practices guide for permitting for decarbonization related technologies such as heat pumps, EV chargers, et cetera. It's a pretty exciting effort, and a lot of folks are outside of our service territory even have been reaching out for that best practices guide, since there's clearly a lot of interest in this area. So we'll have updates on that soon.
That's great. And I guess I would pick up one final comment on Tony's comment. There's a big election coming up on November, and there is going to be a lot of turnover on our staffs, on our councils, just because of term limits in a lot of cities and other issues. So I think having a clear understanding of how this program would help educate the new electeds is going to be really important to go forward with the bigger picture ideas that we're looking to achieve. So just offer that as a thought. Thank you. And I do appreciate everything that's been done. Really, I do.
Thank you, Liz. Anyone else with some parting comments? Nancy? Unmute.
Sorry. Briefly, my question is why could we not make a more aggressive reduction goal part of our plan? And secondly, is it possible to highlight some of the cornerstone actions that are both impactful and in our control?
For the first question, we have already budgeted and in the work plan to revisit our greenhouse gas emissions forecasting model and potentially license an external model, such as maybe an E3 pathways model, to really update that, and it would inform the development of even sector-specific targets. And so that is in the work plan for 2021. As a part of that process, we would definitely be reevaluating the overall GHG emissions reductions goals. And so I would say there's no reason why there's not necessarily a new emissions reduction target in this plan, except that that wasn't kind of a part of the scope, because we knew that this was in the pipeline and it would cover both buildings and transportation. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty given the shelter in place and kind of changes and patterns, but we can deal with that next year. And then I'm not sure if I understood your second question regarding highlighting some of the cornerstone actions.
Yeah, I'll refer you to the letter that we received from public comment that suggested a tighter set of priorities to hone them to fit them into agency resources. So I'll just refer you to the letter that came in kind of right before the meeting. So for clarification, I think they're good questions and good suggestions. And they do mention the on-bill financing, which I asked about earlier, so.
Sure. So I did take a look. I had a little bit of time to take a look at the letter, and I'm happy to provide some kind of initial comments. I think the priorities, the tighter set of priorities that were proposed, yeah, so I guess the elimination of the REACH code effort and a couple of the other priorities, I would need to spend some time if the executive committee were wanting a change in the plan to transition towards this different set of priorities, and I would want some time to kind of evaluate that and engage with other stakeholders. As I mentioned, there were a lot of people involved in the development of these 6 priorities, and so I think they're largely, though, in line, the way that I had at least read the letter, largely in line with kind of what they're proposing. And the implementation plan that we'd bring forward to the board, we aren't going to propose something that we can't deliver on. And so that implementation plan would be the resources that would be needed to implement what we're proposing. Hopefully that answers the question.
I will work with the authors of the letter to see if there's further, refinements to their suggestions. I'm personally feel that the mix of actions proposed is correct in the proposed staff's proposed draft, and would look to staff to work it out in the implementation plan. So I'm okay moving forward with it as it is, but I will work back with the authors of the letter and see, how to make sure their concerns are addressed, if possible.
Final thoughts, Margaret? Margaret's good. Rod, final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm good. I mean, we know this is a plan, and the details will unfold in ensuing years. I'm joking, of course, about trying to figure it all out now. we will have good successors who will work with staff to and the community to sort these things out. Interesting to hear that there's some concern in Mountain View. We haven't had that yet in Cupertino, to my knowledge. So I do appreciate the idea that just because we've passed something doesn't mean we're done. We need to redouble our efforts to educate the community, get the contractors, get the architects and the specifiers and so forth. I appreciate everybody's comments. I think we all have a lot to add here. And so know that it's a plan and it's never going to be done, right? We just need to keep working on it and we'll get there. But Liz, you've had great comments. Margaret, really appreciated yours. Howard, as always, I just have a lot of respect for all of you as colleagues. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to leave the final word to Girish. My comments are, first, great job to staff. Second, this is the front edge of the movement, you guys. There isn't the clearness of the answer is not as obvious because we're really pushing to change the world here. And I think Amy has heard what we feel are some of the challenges. Between the architects and the builders and the contractors and the citizens, we've got a world of minds to change. And with that, Girish, if you'd like to summarize where you think we are, and again, let us, from the board, I really want to make sure staff and everybody knows we are super appreciative that we've asked you to change the world, and you guys are bringing back plans to do that.
Great, thank you, Howard. So immediate kind of follow-up actions. Liz, we'll have a meeting set up with you to get into a little bit more detail about some of the comments and questions and suggestions you had. I thought they were very good. And we'll also reach out to the authors of the letter. And I want to emphasize, I think what Rod and Howard said is exactly the way I'm thinking about it too. This is the first time we've come up with such a plan. We've got to iterate. Just like the integrated resource plan, which is looking at our power supply, we update it every 2 years. There's a plan, you implement, you make changes, and then the environment changes. And then you adapt to that. The last thing I'd say, I think this came about very clearly from public comments and all of you, is it's the education, communication, winning the hearts and minds. There's a lot to do there. I had teed up, first of all, Amy is hiring someone who's about half this person's time is going to be spent on implementing this plan. We're also looking at a government relations person to be engaged more with the community and all of you and the council. So I think putting the implementation plan together and the resources to make this successful, we're just starting with that. So we have the plan and now we're working on the implementation. So thank you very much for your comments. This is the first, this is a giant, bold action on the building side. similar to what we've done in the power side. So thank you.
Giant and bold is the best summary. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Grish. Thanks to my fellow board members. This was discussion, and we are going to move on to number 4, which is our PG&E carbon-free allocation for 21 through 23.
Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Monica Padilla, Director of Power Resources. So the reason we're here today is to get your support for a recommendation that we plan to take to the board in October to approve accepting PG&E's large hydro and nuclear carbon-free allocations for the calendar years 2021 through 2023, and to delegate the authority of the CEO to enter into necessary agreements. Next slide. Just a little bit of history, as you're all aware, or most of you are aware, that SVCE pays a power cost and difference adjuster for all of the resources in PG&E's portfolio that are considered above market. And so these would include hydro and nuclear. And because PG&E basically attributed no additional premium to these carbon-free resources, we pay a pretty high PCIA, or our customers pay a high PCIA for those carbon-free resources. In addition, SVCE, because we're a carbon-free CCA, actually go out in the market and buy carbon-free resources every year to help balance our renewable portfolios resources and achieve that carbon-free standard. So last year, the CPUC approved an interim allocation out of PG&E's portfolio for carbon-free resources. And subsequent to that, the SVCE board in April approved a decision to take the large hydro and nuclear, which were allotted to us for the July to December 2020 timeframe. Next slide. So in total, we estimate that we're going to get essentially 134,000 or so megawatt hours of large hydro and about 474,000 megawatt hours of nuclear. There's still a lot of uncertainty associated with what these deliveries will be. For nuclear, it's pretty firm as the resource, the nuclear plant, Diablo Canyon, runs essentially 24/7. But large hydro is very much dependent on precip conditions and what PG&E is able actually to generate from its facilities. So while we expect to get about this much until actually the year is over, we actually don't know what we received. And when we add this to the uncertainty and the lack of firmness that we had with some other hydro resources in our portfolio before PG&Es were added, we're actually looking at, even though we're going to have a surplus in 2020, it's not that big of a surplus, at least not what we thought we were going to have going into the year. And so it's very difficult to sell these resources, especially where we don't know if they're going to come through or not. So we're not likely to sell any surplus resources for 2020. Next slide. So we have been working with some other CCAs and reaching out to PG&E to see what they intend to do beyond 2020. There is a process or proceeding going on at the CPUC, the working group number 3 PCIA portfolio allocation proceeding, which was supposed to address how to deal with long-term resources and PG&E's carbon-free allocations. But that process has been somewhat slow. In the interim, PG&E is actually considering taking to the CPUC, they have taken to the CPUC or sent to the CPUC an advice letter requesting allocation of their nuclear and large hydro for the 2021 through 2023 period. The CPUC is expected to make a decision on this by October 31st. We've, along with some other CCAs, have submitted a letter to the CPUC asking for them to consider the advice letter that PG&E has provided and to make that consideration before October 31st, as we'd like to know earlier rather than later what to plan for in 2021. Next slide. So SVCE still has a fairly large open position in meeting its carbon free. Again, we are about 50% RPS and about 50% carbon free non-RPS resources going all the way through 2026. And then as our RPS starts to increase, our dependence on large hydro or carbon-free resources decreases. But essentially, this just illustrates potentially what our large overposition could be. And then the cost of meeting these carbon-free annual requirements is increasing every year as the premium to pay for those resources is getting higher every year as well. Next slide. So we estimate that that we could essentially close our carbon-free position at 50% if we were able to take PG&E's, our pro rata share of PG&E's large hydro for that 2021 to 2023 period, along with the nuclear, and then coupling that with the purchases that we've made to date. We essentially get to 50%, which is what we need. And that would save us.
Excuse me, Monica, you fade off at the end of your sentences. So if you could speak a little more.
Sure, I'll get closer to the mic.
Thanks, appreciate it.
So my point was that if we were able to receive our pro rata share of PG&E's large hydro and nuclear allocations, coupled with the purchases that we've made so far for carbon-free, we could essentially close our carbon-free position through 2023 with a savings of about $11 to $20 million, depending on the premium that we would pay otherwise for these carbon-free resources. And that amounts to about a 1.5% to 3% annual supply cost savings. Next slide. So again, our recommendation or our request is that you support a recommendation to the board to accept the large hydro and carbon-free allocations for 2021-2023. As an alternative, as we've talked about before, we could accept only the large hydro and reject the nuclear if we wanted to make sure that it didn't show up on our power content label. And the savings associated with that alternative would be 3 to 6 million over the 3-year period versus, again, the 11 to 20 million. And I also should add that all of this is contingent on the CPUC actually approving PG&E's advice letter on October 31st or earlier, or whenever they decide to approve that. There's no guarantee that any of this would actually be available to us in 2021. So this is kind of just setting up our ducks so that if it does happen, we have everything to go forward. So that's all I have. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, there's one more slide, Monica.
Oh.
Yeah. Do your last slide, then Grish, and then we'll go to comments, questions from the board.
I think the next slide just talks about next steps.
Important slide.
So I could take that actually. So as Monica said, there are some process details with the CPUC, but I wanted to frame this, even connecting it to what we just talked about at the last item. We have the kind of actions we have to take are going to have to be so bold, right? We did awesome with reach codes, but that's barely the start. I mean, getting to existing buildings, we need to do so much more. So when I think about this issue, I kind of boil it down to what are the incremental benefit that SVCE can bring to the community and the country? And it takes money to actually get stuff done. Everything that we're going to do in the building decarb plan, whether it's incentives for customers to move to electric appliances, it's the resources we have to put in place to educate designers, developers, council members, winning the hearts and minds. All these things take resources, and that is a true incremental benefit. It actually reduces emissions. So this issue on accepting the nuclear allocation, we've gone through a lot of policy discussion prior. And I think, and we've kind of landed in a place where we decided to accept it. So I wanted to kind of focus on this last bullet, because this money that we are going to get, if all these things get approved by the PUC and everything else, somewhere between 11 and 20 million, that's real money that can be used to leverage that really accelerated timeline or that steep slope that we have to be on to reduce emissions. And that really gets to our mission. So I wanted to make sure that as we talk about this, it's almost like, and this is money that we are paying, we're paying for this already with PG&E. So these are some of the arguments and the discussion that we already had, but I wanted to bring it back, that there really is an opportunity to utilize a large chunk or all of this money to actually reduce emissions incrementally. And of course, we'll bring that back to you. The item at hand is actually accepting these carbon credits, so to speak. I'm not using the right word. Thank you, Howard. That's all I had.
Thank you, Girish, and thank you, Monica. It is sort of Groundhog Day in a way because we have talked about this at many, many, many points, and we'll go around with everybody. I don't have any questions, and I am comfortable with taking the entire carbon-free portfolio because we can use the money. Liz, you have your hands up?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify the same point. Am I correct that, as far as I can understand, there's only one thing that's changed from all our previous conversations and debates. We're essentially in the same place. We've been able to identify some dollar values that I don't recall seeing before. But what I don't remember is what I'm hearing as the tentativeness of having this go forward. Is there a risk to it not going forward, and then we have to cover our carbon credits another way?
Yeah, so the CPUC holds the ultimate decision on whether or not the allocation is going to get approved. PG&E is not able to make that decision on their own. They can only advise the CPUC on what they desire to do with their portfolio. It's unlikely that the CPUC will say no. I don't know why they would say no, but it is their prerogative. So, and if they were to say no and it wasn't available to us, then we would, just like we've done in years past, we would procure on the open market for these carbon-free resources.
Thank you.
Rod or Margaret? I can go to the public first. Members of the public, anybody wish to speak? If you wish to do so, indicate by raising your virtual hand. We have a couple speakers.
All right, we'll go ahead and start with Bruce.
Thank you. Monica, I appreciate the presentation. As you all know, in most of the CCAs, public opinion is strongly opposed to any nuclear content. That's not been the case in Silicon Valley, and as PG&E has lost customers, its nuclear fraction has increased over the last couple of years from 27% of its energy to 44%. So by accepting this allocation, we would still be substantially less nuclear than PG&E. At the last executive committee meeting, I talked about the fact that PG&E's 2019 power content label shows that they too are 100% greenhouse gas free. And in conversations with Girish and Dawn, it appears that they were able to achieve that by having over procured and being able to pick and choose which of the resources go into the power content label, because those are the resources they choose to say were delivered to customers, and which resources they sold to somebody else other than their retail and commercial customers. I don't fully understand that, but the point is, from a strategic standpoint, I hope that Monica might be able to address the issue of whether SVCE and other CCAs taking some of this nuclear allocation might make it harder or impossible for PG&E in its 2021 power content label to claim that they're 100% greenhouse gas free like Silicon Valley Clean Energy is. If that were the case, I think that would amplify the reason from a competitive standpoint that SVCE would want to take both the hydro and nuclear allocations. And I would just like to emphasize the previous comment that it's going to take a lot of money to implement and successfully deliver the kind of programs that Amy talked about. And that's the primary reason why I think it's a really good idea to take these allocations for the next 3 years and possibly beyond until Diablo Canyon closes. Thanks, that's all I had to say today.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you. Up next, we have James Talea.
Hi, this is James, and I also wanted to strongly support the staff recommendation to accept allocations from both the hydro and the nuclear for the same reasons during the previous discussion on this. You know, reiterating that I also agree with what CEO Garish said, that and Bruce backed up, that this is these building decarb efforts and other efforts that we're trying to do through SVCE and the member agencies require a lot of resources and attention and staff, and we want to be able to do as much of that as we can, and it's we can't just throw away money that's in front of us that would not have any real negative impacts. Also, just briefly on the last topic, that the letter that came in was from the Fossil Free Buildings in Silicon Valley campaign, and I'm on the advisory group for that. And just to clarify, you know, and I appreciate that Director Smith brought that up so that I can follow up with her and staff. And we don't mean that other items should not be considered or done, just want to point out some that we see as some of the most important and potentially early impactful, to make sure that when the coming implementation plan details come out, that those are highlighted or at least not lost, and to, if there are any resource challenges on what gets prioritized within this overall structure, that you know, some of these things that were specifically mentioned, I think were meant to be made clear that we were thinking were very important to not lose sight of, and that it also emphasizes the need for working regionally, and SVCE, because it has such great staff and leadership, really can show play that role of regional leader even beyond what its official territory covers. We really need SVCE to stand up and do that work as it is capable of doing, to help guide the whole regional effort. And these 33 regional advocacy organizations, as part of this campaign, we've been very active with the REACH Code effort so far, and are ready and eager to continue to work with SVCE and all the member agencies here, and with PCE and its member agencies on these efforts. Thank you.
Thanks. One last speaker.
Yes, Tony, you.
You know, people that I typically agree with often accuse others of ignoring science and just being blind to issues we care about, like climate change. Well, hearing that others are against taking these assets reminds me that some folks that we often agree with can sometimes ignore science as well. So looking at this issue where it doesn't matter at all about how much nuclear energy is produced in this state, for example, it's a perfect example of why we want to do this. I am so pleased that SVCE staff is fully on board with this, and even more pleased that the active, quote, activist, end quote, folks that we work with see the writing on the wall as well. And it's just a real pleasure to work with a bunch of people who believe in science. Thanks much.
Thank you, Tony. All right, so I will come back to us, the board. Nancy or Rod, since you guys haven't spoken yet, or Margaret?
Yeah, I'm ready with a motion.
Yes.
Yeah, I move we accept staff recommendation.
I second.
Okay.
I'm delighted. You know, I think we're being rational and doing what's really in all of our interests. So I just don't have a comment other than to thank you for teeing this up and all the prep it took to get us here. So
I appreciate that, and I'm going to ditto Rod's rational comment. Anyone else want to say anything before we call the question?
I was briefly going to speak to my motion that the feedback that I've gotten from members of the public are, why don't you have nuclear? It's carbon free. And I've been able to say, well, actually, you know, check your statements. It's there. So I'm happy to make the recommendation to support staff's work, and hope my colleagues support it, because we have done the heavy lifting to get to where we are today.
So speaking of heavy lifting, honestly, and I don't mean it in a bad way because the board takes a lot of care in feeding, it feels like we have made and remade this decision like 5 times as the board. We're not changing the policy direction we've been giving for the last year. When this comes back to the whole board, should we just let staff put this on the consent calendar? Margaret's nodding yes.
I'm fine with that.
wow, okay. Why not? Somebody can pull it if they choose to.
And I
Yes,
think, I think our consensus would be to, again, we got so many policy things that we're still trying to figure out. This one's already done. It just feels like we don't need to return over the hay pile again.
And to your point, we have spent a lot of time talking about this in the last year. And so, yeah, we're extending it basically, right?
Yeah, so
That's
Grace,
what we're doing.
is that acceptable?
yes, it's very acceptable. And what we'll do is we will have a presentation attached to the staff report, which goes over, I'd say we'll add a timeline of all the times we've discussed this at the policy at the board level.
Yeah.
And
That's
we'll
it.
have the presentation attached to the staff report. So if any board member would like to pull it, we will have a presentation ready to go.
And I think, Girish, in your one-on-ones with those who choose to accept your invitation, but the board members who do, you can remind them that we've been through this.
Correct. There's no change in policy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And with that, if we could get our roll call vote, please.
Chair Miller,
Aye.
Vice Chair Smith,
Aye.
Gibbons,
Aye.
Sinks,
Aye.
Abekova.
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries unanimously.
All right, excellent. So moving right along, we just want to talk about the amending the, action item, sorry. Amending the master consulting agreements.
Hey, it's me again. So next slide. Just a quick overview. We rely heavily on consultants that we've retained under a master consulting agreement structure. And when the board approved the use of these consultants under this structure, they gave us a not to exceed or authority limit of $1 million. That was done back in September, October of 2018. Since then, our increases in complexity and our lack of bandwidth for staff has necessitated that we use these consultants quite a bit, actually. And specifically, Ascend Analytics has been providing the majority of the support that to augment staff capabilities and capacity. And so we just wanted to let you know that this is kind of just the where we're at, and we do intend to issue an RFP in 2021 sometimes to see what to do for the next 3 years or the next 3 to 5 years. But for now, we're asking for the exec committee to support a recommendation that would be going to the board again in October to amend the current authority under the master consulting agreements, otherwise referred to as MCA, from $1 million to $1.5 million, and to extend the term, the expiration term from September 30th, 2021 to March 31st, 2022. And we're hopeful that in that period of time, we'll be able to put in a different alternative solution, both in terms of staffing and new consultants under the RFP that we issue. Next slide. Just a little bit of history there. Again, we've relied heavily on several consultants. For the most part, it's in analytics, but the MCA also includes Hanover Strategy Advisors, Flynn Resources Consulting, and E3, which I can't remember what all the E stand for, but E3, they've been doing a lot of stuff around virtual PPA, virtual power plants and distributed energy resources. But this is just kind of a list of some of the services and analysis and compliance reporting that these consultants have helped us with, along with a lot of kind of strategic evaluation and thinking around how to provide custom products and services to our larger commercial industrial customers. That was a direct response to the threat of direct access. Next slide. So when the board approved the master consulting agreements and the $1 million spending authority, they also put in place some controls, including that all of the projects or tasks or services provided by a consultant had to be done through a task order approval process, which would need to be signed off by the CEO. They also required that we inform the board of spending, and this was done through quarterly reports in the CEO report to the board. And then last, of course, nothing could be spent unless the board actually appropriated funds through its fiscal year budget process. And this table here shows in summary how much has been spent and or plans to be spent and whatever the remaining balance. So you can see we're running pretty tight. If we end up spending everything we think we're going to spend through fiscal year 21, we'll end up with basically about $7,000 left in the budget. And we don't want to go over, and we want to be able to plan our workload and the analysis and the projects that we're working on with the expectation that we'll have those consultants and the funds available for us. Next slide. And just to kind of reiterate on what we, in addition to all the stuff they're already helping us with, there's some new stuff that we're intending to carry out in the next fiscal year, including the implementation of some of the action items that were identified in the 2021 to 30 integrated resource plan that the board recently approved. And there we call for some pretty hefty analysis around getting to a carbon-free 24/7 portfolio and implementing kind of a green policy around resource or preferred policy around resource adequacy. So before we can come to the board with a recommendation on implementing these types of initiatives, we need some analysis, and we need some big engines to help us run those analyses that would set risk and potential costs and potential benefits. We've also kind of taken the lead on this long duration storage, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a later presentation. But Ascend Analytics is going to be one of the consultants, in addition to other consultants that some of the other CCAs have retained to provide analytical support for us on that effort. We continue to work on large custom product offerings. In the programs and Decarb, we're looking at a virtual power plant evaluation effort that'll be carried out this year as well. And then just implementation and evaluation of PPAs for renewable, to meet our renewable portfolio standard is an ongoing function. Next slide. So until we're able to, again, put in place a more longer term solution, which would involve augmenting our staff and actually filling the positions that have been approved, we ask that in the interim that you authorize again an extension of the NCA authority through March 31st, 2022, and increase the not to exceed amount from 1 million to 1.5 million. And the motion or the recommendation is here as well. I don't know if I have a next step. I don't think I have a next step on this one. That would be it.
All good, very detailed. Are there any questions, Liz?
Just a quick, easy one. I'm fine with all of this, of course, but we did say early on that when we did contracts in the beginning, that they might need to be tweaked if they get renewed, because we learned some things in contract language. So I would just request that the contracts be reviewed by council. And I also think, I've mentioned this before, but perhaps not, just in my mind, that if we have contracts that go beyond 3 years, that we were I'm wondering if there was a policy that we had to rebid certain things. So just to check those, that policy and have the contracts reviewed.
So, Liz, we did look into that. I think this got brought up before. I think there was discussion about 5 years and not 3 really, but it did not get translated into policy. So that's the way it was discussed, as 5 years. But yeah, and that's kind of, maybe we should add it to our policy. We could bring it back. We'll just capture this as one of the items to be dealt with on policy updates.
So, I mean, I would be supportive of this also being on a consent item.
Yeah.
If we put in the language that said the contracts were reviewed for language consistency and we anticipate 5-year kind of relook, something like that. I think that would have a tendency to answer board questions.
Perfect.
Other questions from my fellow board members? Let me check with the public. Any member of the public wish to comment on this item? If you wish to do so, indicate that by raising your virtual hand. Seeing none, I will come back to the board for continued discussion and or motion.
I would make it was too quiet too long. I would make a motion that we accept the staff recommendation to continue these contracts with the additional amount of $500,000 for the extended time period.
Second.
Liz, I got to ask, do you want to include your commentary to include the statements that you mentioned before?
No, that's up to staff. I
Okay.
think it's clear enough for staff. Doesn't need to be in the motion.
Okay, good. Any further discussion? Seeing none, if we could get a roll call vote, please.
Chair Miller,
Aye.
Vice Chair Smith,
Yes.
Gibbons,
Yes.
Sinks,
Aye.
Abekoga.
Aye.
Thank you. That motion carries unanimously.
Perfect. Thank you, staff, and thank you, board. The last item is an update on long duration storage discussion.
Ooh.
So while it's coming up, I'll just start. It's going to be Monica and I who are going to do this. I'll start and end. So long duration storage comes out of the integrated resource plan. Basically, the PUC has asked all load serving entities, all 50 of us in the state, to look at long duration storage. They identified in their 2 plans that long duration storage should be part of these portfolios. About 10 CCAs have got together to work on this. Monterey and us are kind of taking the lead on it. And one is the RFO, which is actually seeing what kind of transaction we can enter into. The second is the formation of a super JPA. So the formation of the super JPA, we plan to bring it back to you in December, and I'll talk to you about it more at the end of the presentation. So Monica, back to you.
Monica, you're on mute.
Thank you. For those of you maybe not as familiar with long duration energy storage or LDS, these are batteries which by definition have the ability to discharge for a minimum of 8 hours. So these are long duration in the sense that they, like the ones that we've acquired thus far through our solar with storage, have only been 4 hours or less. These are intended to be something that we can actually count on for a longer period of time. In addition, we are defining them as ones that can be grid charged. Again, different than the ones that we've invested in or contracted for, which can only be charged by the renewable resource or the solar project. These can actually be charged by the grid. That's important for reliability purposes, especially when there's no sun or the wind doesn't blow, these batteries can be ready to go to help meet grid reliability at any time. Technologies, there's a whole bunch of stuff out there, including lithium ion, which is what we're most familiar with, and again, in the resources that we've acquired. But there's also chemical flow batteries, gravity fed, pumped hydro, compressed air, and a whole bunch of new emerging technologies. We learned a lot about this through an RFI, or request for information, that we, along with, I think, 13 other CCAs or 14 other CCAs throughout the state, issued back in June. And then we kind of got a sense of what types of technologies are viable or kind of just interesting to look at. Again, as Garish mentioned, this is long duration storage, or LDS resources, are going to be really important to help integrate not just our renewable portfolio, but overall throughout the state. And because of that, the CPUC has identified a humongous need to add LDS by 2026 to meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals. LDS resources also have the ability to help us meet our energy needs. They provide a tool or a resource for us to hedge our load and also hedge our resource adequacy and ancillary service costs. Next slide. So as Garish mentioned again, we issued the RFI back in June 2020. We intend to issue a request for offer or proposals, maybe not this month, but certainly by October. Things are changing as we move. This is a pretty big project to undertake. There's essentially 8 of us that will be involved in this multi-CCA RFO, and we're looking to acquire up to 500 megawatts potentially of long duration storage. So it's not, it certainly is a big effort. And then, as Garish is going to talk about later, what we're doing in terms of the Super JPA formation, which will help facilitate the procurement of one or more LDS resources, and then also provide a quick update on some of the outreach that we've undertaken with regulators and legislators with respect to our procurement efforts around LDS. Next slide. So just quickly summarizing, this slide needs to be updated. I think the CCAs involved in the RFO will now only be 8. SVCE is going to be hosting the RFO. Again, we're looking to buy up to 500 megawatts. It could be through one or more projects, most likely more than one project. We will be technology agnostic. We're going to carry out a very in-depth analysis, again, using one or more of the consultants under the master consulting agreement that we just talked about. Because at the end of the day, while we understand that the state has signaled the need to include LDS in our portfolios as being very important, there's many different ways to acquire LDS, and some projects and technologies are very expensive. And we need to be able to stand behind any resource as making sense for our portfolio and our customers' need. We're not going to go forward with a project that is very expensive and doesn't show any value to our ratepayers. We're also requiring through this RFO that while the project doesn't have to be located within the CalISO, it has to be able to directly connect to the CalISO. So it has to have the transmission and the import capabilities to bring it into the CalISO, since we're trying to achieve grid reliability within the area that our customers are exposed to. And then last and not least, through this RFO, we're signaling to the market that we intend to buy this as one entity, and that entity is a Super JPA, sorry. And I think Garish is going to talk more about why we intend to do it through the Super JPA process. Next slide. So this is over to Garish.
Okay. So a Super JPA essentially is going to be 8 of us together working on this. There'll actually be more, I should say 10. So there are 10 of us who are interested in the Super JPA. 2 of the folks within this group are not going to be part of the RFO. The Super JPA as a whole, it brings us economies of scale. It allows us to de-risk, and it's also very strategic, right? So this is the first time we're doing it, and it's really showing there's some very positive response that we're getting from people we've talked to about this. We expect the long duration storage project will be the first project. We've hired a law firm and the executive director of another JPA to help us through with the enabling agreement. So the first draft is out. The attorneys are reviewing it. We expect that the JPA agreement itself is going to be very skeletal. It's going to be a very minimum, the minimum required to create a JPA. And so it'll be very much like an enabling agreement. And depending on the project, that's where all the risk factors, cost allocation will be worked out. And this kind of works, right? So we'll set up the structure first. We do that by December. The responses on the RFO are going to come in the first week of December. And then we get into actually transacting and negotiating starting the first quarter of 2021. And by then we'll have the JPA established. We need that organization to be able to have one counterparty or one face dealing with counterparties. Next slide, please. So here's the timeline, and we have two timelines. The top timeline is around the RFO that Monica talked about, and the bottom timeline is around the Super JPA enabling agreement. And the bars in green are identical to both. This is where they kind of overlap, right? So when we actually negotiate that long duration energy storage and participation agreements, that's where you'll have the Super JPA participants being involved in that. Next slide. So in terms of outreach, we've had a few meetings, 2 meetings already. We have met with the entire IRP team at the CPUC. There must have been about a dozen people there. We got some, on our side, it was MCE, who was key in putting out the RFI, CalCCA staff, and then SVCE staff. We got some very positive feedback from them. They're glad that we are doing this. One of the parting comments that the PUC staff had was, one is, this kind of model de-risks this kind of investment. They also appreciated that we were being proactive under uncertainty. Another point that Monica made and they mirrored back that was also important was the RFO was looking at cost effectiveness as a criteria. Because when we see the results in the RFI, this stuff is expensive. So we then reached out to the state legislature, basically the consultants to all the key committees, appropriations, the Senate and Assembly energy committees. They were all present at this meeting. We also got very positive feedback from them. They liked the fact that we are moving forward with a kind of collaborative role in procurement. Just so you know, the 10 CCAs that are interested in the JPA, together we are about 6,500 megawatts and 34,000 gigawatt hours. So this is a rather large size. And so when the legislature kind of looks at the size of an organization or the ability to transact, I think they feel good about this. So they had several questions for us, and they also asked if we were reaching out to the municipal utilities. They said we've kept in touch with them, and I have since talked to SCAPA down south and the JPA up north NCPA, and I'll be talking to CMUA later this afternoon. We've also set up a meeting with the CAISO for later this week. I told you I've reached out to public power. We'll also be reaching out to the financial community to see how they're looking at the Super JPA. Next slide. All right. So the next step, so this is an information item for you. We are looking to kind of giving you a heads up that we will be requesting the approval of the enabling agreement in December. We will come back to the executive committee in November with details on what the actual enabling agreement looks like. So you'll get a chance to see that and provide us guidance. And then, of course, the actual project agreement will be in the third quarter of 2021. Note that I mentioned right in my opening remarks, the CEO report. We'll also be bringing you the bond conduit approval for the prepay will be coming to you in the last part of the year too. So some big structural things that we are bringing to the board. That's all I have. Monica and I are open for questions.
I have a couple questions just right off the bat. When we originally started talking about long-term storage, it didn't feel like 8 hours was the threshold of long-term. And the other question is, it sounds like, well, there's a lot of technologies, some of them are 100 years old. We've settled in that battery is the only answer that's viable, or am I just misinterpreting the slides?
No, I think we have pumped hydro in there as well. So in the RFO, we're not limiting the term of the project in terms of what we're willing to contract. We're requiring at least 10 years, but we recognize that some of these projects, including pumped hydro, they're looking at 50-year contract terms.
Right.
By not limiting the maximum number of years, we'll encourage proposals from those types of technologies as well. And in terms of the question about whether it should be 8 hours or 12 hours or multiple days, that's one that we've also kind of turned on as well, because there really isn't a clear definition about what long duration storage is. And but what we're looking at it is its ability to meet reliability requirements. And so if we had something that was on standby and could discharge for 8 hours, would that get us through some of the reliability, potential reliability issues that we have in the future? And I think that that's kind of consensus that 8 hours is probably enough, maybe even too much. It seems like, and this is some of the stuff that we hope to also get from the CalISO when we meet with them. A colleague, or Eric Kim, who used to work at the CalISO, has some insight as to what they've been talking about in terms of LDS. And their durations tend to go from 8 to 12 hours as well. So we're hoping to get that feedback from them, but for now we had to set something, and 8 as a minimum, not a maximum, just a minimum, seems like it would get us some proposals.
Yeah, I think it was first time I'd seen 8. It just felt short, but the science and the math is what it is, so I'm good there. And I wasn't proposing that we go find an abandoned mine and pressurize it like they've done in Europe to save energy. But anyway, all good. Are there other questions? Liz and then Rod?
Thanks. Just a couple. Actually, I think this first one you're going to answer when you come back with more details about the structure of the board and the management and so forth. So I'll look forward to that. The only other question I had was, does any of this have to go to our city council boards for approval, or is it all approved at our local board level?
Great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, the SVCE, I checked in with our general counsel, and the SVCE board makes this decision.
Okay, that just be a time problem otherwise.
Yep. And right now, our thinking is the first question you asked, great one too. Our thinking at this point is that each board would decide who's on the Super JPA board. That's the way it's being set up right now. And that's part of the discussions we're all going to have over the next month or so.
My other question had to do with financial stability. If one of the joint partners is having financial solvency issues,
Yep.
we have to be prepared for that.
That is a vital issue, and that will get handled in the project agreements. Right now, we are developing project principles, which will, at least on a principle basis, address that. So those are the, so you'll see that when you see the Super JPA, when we bring it back to you, you'll have the agreement itself, which is the structure, and then you'll have the project principles that we all should be looking at. So you'll have an idea of what's going to be put into the project agreements.
And I have to confess, it's the first time I've seen the word agnostic predicated by technology.
Okay, and on that thought, Rod?
technology agnostic. I'm quite used to that term, but yeah, I appreciate Liz's comment. Right, there's sure benefits to doing this because particularly if we get to carry an outsized profile that we're not able to with the state, its regulators, and so forth. I hadn't really thought so much about that before, but that makes this very attractive. I wonder to the query about municipal utilities, does it make any sense to try to include them in this JPA, or are interests not aligned enough for the things we'd want to do, or risks or whatever?
I've talked to both sets of JPAs, and they are not interested in joining. It'll be open to them. I think they would like to participate in agreements that we negotiate. So if we go out for an RFO and we have a large quantity, they would like to negotiate their piece. So they would like to partner with us on that. So I think that's a very good first step in partnering with public power.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. I think Liz asked the right questions, which is go to governance and risk management. If, you know, we're going to have some agencies that are going to be in a stronger position than others, and when our interests differ, how do we ensure that, you know, if one of our CCAs is faltering, that can't take down the deal. But I think the advantages of this sounds to me like surely outweigh the risks, and so sounds like a great plan, and glad we're doing it.
Any other comments or questions? Let me check with the public. Any member of the public wish to comment on this item? If you wish to do so, you can indicate by raising your virtual hand. Seeing no members of the public, I come back to us. Anybody with any final thoughts? This was just a discussion. I will just close, Grish, by saying thank you guys for pursuing this. Long-term storage is going to be one of these things that's necessary. My biggest fear is that, well, not that they're going to move the goalposts. We don't really even know where the goalposts are at the state level. And so I think as we continue to explore this, I think more will be revealed by what the grid really needs to be reliable. And I'm glad that we're putting ourselves in a position of strength to be able to do this.
Howard, can I ask one more question?
Sure, go ahead, Rod.
Yeah, some of us were down. Well, some of us from the Air District, among others, were down, and Don White's happened to be there. We went down to the National Fuel Cell Research Center at UC Irvine last fall, I guess it was. And they talked about hydrogen as a promising vehicle for storage. In other words, okay, we have water, we have an abundance of solar, we split it to store hydrogen, and then, you know, store it in a big tank, I guess, or a reservoir or some such thing. That's the kind of storage that if it proves economically feasible, and I frankly don't know, they were making incredible promises, you know, you could think could be a vehicle that would last not hours but days. I just wonder if anybody is aware of the state of hydrogen as a potential storage means.
We'll bring something back to you. I think just long duration storage probably deserves a couple of primers almost for the board.
Yeah.
Just like, you know, years ago, we talked about solar and wind and the characteristics of those resources. We are learning quite a bit, both from some of the consultants we have and the responses to the RFI. But we'll take that as an action item and bring it back to the board.
I mean, they were pitching the idea of adding 15% hydrogen to the natural gas lines, right? And then fuel cells, which to me wasn't as exciting as the idea of hydrogen as just pure hydrogen as a creation and storage means.
Yeah, actually, NCPA is getting into a pilot project on green hydrogen, and they're getting some federal funds to help them with that. So we'll connect up with them too, see what they're doing, and maybe you can have someone from their JPA give a short presentation on their project.
Yeah, and it may be worth checking in with Dawn to see
Yep.
if her thinking has evolved on this, because she was in that meeting. Thank you.
As Rod foretells, this area is super big in energy development at this point, and all sorts of technologies are going to come to bear in the next 10 years. So, and I'm glad we're putting together the structure, so we'll be players in this. Any final comments? Seeing none, we'll call that one done. Any committee or staff remarks? Seeing none, then I think we're going to call this meeting adjourned. I want to thank everybody, a little on the long side, but a lot of important stuff we covered today. Bye.